So now, what's happening in the New Zealand economy? Well, Finance Minister Bill English is in Sydney today and he spoke to Chief Business Reporter Andrew Robertson.
Bill English, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
New Zealand's official cash rate of 3.5% would be just about the highest in the Western world. How much has that contributed to the Kiwi dollar being almost on parity with the Australian dollar at the moment?
I think it's had a considerable influence on it over the shorter term, although we were about 75 cents against the Australian dollar in 2011. So it's been a pretty consistent, sustained rise. And for our exporters to Australia, of course, it's gone a bit too far. That's probably putting too much pressure on them.
Well, just on that issue, the Governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand says the New Zealand dollar at the moment is unsustainably high and unjustifiably high. I mean, how much damage is it doing to your economy?
Well, our export sector has been surprisingly resilient because we had, prior to this sort of episode of a high dollar against Australia, it's been high against the US dollar up until about 6 months ago, probably for 5 or 6 years before that. So our export sector has proven to be surprisingly resilient. They've come out of the recession more productive, more organised, more focused, better understanding of their customers, better products. So they've been able to sustain a fairly steady strengthening in the New Zealand dollar. But of course there'll be limits to how far they can go with that.
Now, as well as a high dollar, you have something else in common with Australia, and that's a very overheated housing market. In fact, according to the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, your market is much more overheated than the Australian market. How big a risk is it to the New Zealand economy?
Well, I think it's a risk, and it's one we're doing our best to manage. So it's confined largely to Auckland, and we're dealing there with the legacy of planning processes that were designed to prevent Auckland growing, going back starting in the late 90s.
Well, you mentioned Auckland, and house prices there have tripled in about the last decade. I mean, can you unwind this bubble without doing serious damage to the economy?
Yes, I think we can, and we have to focus on our top priority, which is getting the supply working better. So we have pretty strong migration figures at the moment. New Zealanders have got, looking at sustainable, moderate increases in their incomes out over the next 4 or 5 years, a pretty positive environment, and that is that's pushing up demand. So we have to get supply of land and of new houses on the ground faster, and it's proving to be a long, complex job, but we're making progress.
Now, that every now and then in Australia there's a debate about macroprudential controls, because as I've noted, we have housing issues here as well. New Zealand introduced macroprudential controls in 2013. Is it fair to say they haven't worked?
Well, there's been really one significant use of them, and that's around restricting the number of loans that are over 80% of the value of the house. And that did have some impact for a while, but I think the other forces of demand have probably overcome that restriction to a significant extent, and just in the last 5 or 6 months. Either way, neither those macroprudential controls or others that are being contemplated are going to make a significant difference. They'll make some change at the margin. We have to concentrate on growing the supply as fast as we can, and that's largely an issue around regulatory constraint, and also about the views of a community about whether they want to grow, whether they want denser housing. But again, we're making progress here because I think everyone realises this market's out of balance, and they want to see action on it.
When you say that macroprudential controls can make a difference only at the margin, it sounds like your advice to Australia would be don't bother.
I wouldn't say don't bother, because I think the market needs to see that an institution like a reputable institution like the RBA would be taking the issue seriously, that a fast rising housing market is not an unmitigated good. It's a potential risk to the macro economy, and also for householders who pay too much. So I think it's, in our experience, it's worthwhile. We've set up a framework that enables the RBNZ to use those tools, and Australia will make its own decisions. But here, as in New Zealand, the key issue though is supply.
New Zealand has enjoyed a boom in dairy prices in recent years, but that boom is over, just like our resources boom is over. You have the rebuilding of Christchurch, which is plugging a lot of the gaps. According to Westpac figures, it will add $35 billion to the New Zealand economy. But when that building boom is over, where is New Zealand's next economic purple patch going to come from?
Well, what we're looking at here is a number of years of sustainable growth. So our growth rate's actually only just a bit faster than Australia, but it does look sustainable out over 3-4 years. And recent forecasts have shown shorter term growth a bit lower than expected, longer term growth a wee bit higher. So the mix will change. Following on from Christchurch, we've still got a large construction catch-up to take place in Auckland of somewhat similar size. And while dairy prices are down, a number of our other export prices are up, and other industries are really starting to get some momentum, like for instance the IT industry, the wine industry, which is now 3 times larger than it was just 10 years ago. So we're seeing a bit more diversification and other industries taking the advantage of a sustained positive environment to lift their investment.
So you see IT and wine exports as key drivers of economic growth in New Zealand in years ahead?
Well, they are just a couple of the higher profile growing industries. But alongside that, you have, for instance, in our manufacturing industry, relatively small compared to Australia, of course, but surprisingly resilient. All sorts of innovation. If you're in New Zealand, you can only survive as an exporter if you're very good at what you do or if you've found your niche. And over the last 5 or 6 years, I think we've seen this real lift in a sense of resilience and confidence among New Zealand businesses, and that's really what's driving the sustainable growth of our economy.
You're delivering your next budget on May the 21st, just 9 days after the next Australian budget. Last year you confidently predicted that the New Zealand budget would be in surplus by now. That was leading into last year's election. Do you regret making that prediction?
Oh no, not at all, because this isn't fundamentally about predictions. It's about the...
It hasn't come through though, has it?
Well, we've yet to see, but it's about the direction of the government's book. So we had a deficit of 9% of GDP just 4 or 5 years ago, and now we're pretty close to balance. We'll see whether it actually comes out as a positive number, but the direction of our government finance is pretty clear, and that is we're heading to surplus. It might take a bit longer, and that will enable us then to start paying down our debt. But it's also proven to be a great anchor for government improving its public services. So we've got a great deal more understanding and thoughtfulness across our public services, who are doing a better job even though the rate of growth of their budgets has been very small.
Given that your Prime Minister has made such a big thing about governments only spending what they earn, I mean, how much of your credibility as a government and a good economic manager is tied up in getting the budget back to surplus?
Well, I mean, it doesn't all hinge on whether there's plus or minus 100 million here or there, I wouldn't think. I think the public at large can see they're getting better public services. They're seeing that government expenditure is under control and has been now for 6 or 7 years. We've been able to stick to the expenditure plans. What's been fluctuating is the revenue, and in this world of which no one really anticipated, of very low interest rates, zero inflation in New Zealand right now, that has a bit of an impact on government revenue. But it's good for households. Households have got more purchasing power than they've had, low gas prices, low interest rates, low inflation. Just a bit tougher for government to get its budget together.
Bill English, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.